The dust-laden wind carried the stench of desperation as Adelaide James stumbled through the crowded auction platform, heavy chains binding her wrists and ankles. The year was 1876, and human decency seemed as scarce as rainfall in the unforgiving Texas borderlands. Her once fine dress, now tattered and stained with the evidence of a 3-day journey in the back of a wagon, hung limply from her slender frame. "Next up, gentlemen, a fine specimen from back east," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the makeshift platform at the edge of Weaverville, Texas. The small settlement had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the nearby hills, bringing with it the usual assortment of prospectors, entrepreneurs, and predators. "A educated lady, this one, can read and write. Might even play the pianoforte for you after she's done with the housework." Laughter rippled through the crowd of men. Adelaide kept her eyes downcast, refusing to meet the leering gazes that crawled over her body like insects. 3 weeks ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Boston. Now, kidnapped and transported across the country under false pretenses of a teaching position at a frontier school, she stood to be sold to the highest bidder. "Starting bid at $50, the auctioneer called, yanking on her chain to make her turn in a circle. "60. Called a voice from the back. "75, countered another. Adelaide forced herself not to tremble. The daughter of a respected physician, she had never imagined herself in such a position. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with little choice but to seek employment. The advertisement for a schoolteacher in the expanding Western Territories had seemed like providence. $100, called a rotund man with tobacco-stained teeth and fingers that resembled sausages. $125, countered another. $200, came a quiet voice from the edge of the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $200 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear $225? The crowd parted slightly, and Adelaide caught sight of him for the first time. Tall and broad-shouldered, he stood with his weight shifted to one leg, thumbs hooked in his belt. A worn leather hat shadowed his features, but she could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were trail-dusty but of good quality, a denim shirt rolled up at the sleeves revealing tanned, muscular forearms, worn leather vest, and dark trousers tucked into scuffed boots. $250, the tobacco man countered angrily. $300, the stranger said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. The auctioneer's grin widened. $300, going once, going twice, $350. The tobacco man shouted, his face reddening with frustration. The stranger sighed almost imperceptibly. $500, he said, stepping forward into the light. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $500 was a small fortune in these parts. $500, the auctioneer repeated breathlessly. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back. Adelaide felt sick as the stranger approached the platform. Her new owner. She fought back tears as the auctioneer handed over her chains to the man, who paid in crisp bills counted from a worn leather wallet. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Rivers," the auctioneer said, tipping his hat. "Can't say the same," the stranger Mr. Rivers responded coldly. He turned to Adelaide, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were a startling blue, like the sky after a thunderstorm had passed. "Come on," he said, not unkindly, giving a gentle tug on the chain. Adelaide followed him wordlessly off the platform, her legs trembling with each step. What would he expect of her? What degradations awaited her at the hands of this stranger? They had barely made it 20 paces from the auction block when the tobacco-stained man stepped into their path. "That's a mighty high price for damaged goods, Rivers," he sneered. "Would have thought you had better sense than to waste money on a skinny thing like her." Mr. Rivers didn't respond, merely tried to step around the man. "Maybe you'd consider a quick profit," the man persisted. "I'll give you $600 for her right now." "She's not for sale," Mr. Rivers said quietly. "Step aside, Haggerty. $700 then." "That's $200 profit without even taking her home." Adelaide felt bile rise in her throat. She was being haggled over like livestock. "I said," Mr. Rivers repeated, his voice dropping dangerously low, "step aside." The man called Haggerty's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. Always did think you were better than the rest of us, Xavier Rivers. Just because your daddy left you that ranch don't make you special. Adelaide's breath caught. Was she about to witness bloodshed over her? In a movement so quick she almost missed it, Xavier Rivers' hand shot out, grabbing Haggerty's wrist before it could reach his gun. The larger man's face contorted with pain as Rivers applied pressure. "These hands break steel for souls like yours, Haggerty," Rivers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walk away." Haggerty's face paled as Rivers squeezed harder. Finally, he nodded jerkily and Rivers released him. Without another word, Haggerty disappeared into the crowd. Rivers turned back to Adelaide, his expression unreadable. "My wagon's this way," he said, gesturing toward a well-maintained buckboard hitched to two chestnut horses. Adelaide followed, her mind racing. This man had just paid a small fortune for her, then refused to sell her at a profit. What did he want from her? When they reached the wagon, Rivers surprised her by producing a small key from his pocket. "Hold still," he murmured, reaching for her wrists. Adelaide flinched away instinctively, earning a frown from Rivers. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice gentler than before. "I'm taking these off." True to his word, he unlocked the manacles around her wrists, then knelt to remove the shackles from her ankles. The metal fell away and Adelaide rubbed her chafed wrists, unable to believe what was happening. "Why?" she asked, finding her voice at last. Rivers straightened, towering over her but somehow not making her feel threatened. "No one deserves to be in chains," he said simply. "Least of all someone who was clearly brought here against her will." Adelaide stared at him, uncomprehending. You're not going to—" "I'm taking you to my ranch," he interrupted, "where you can have a hot meal, a bath, and a safe place to sleep. After that, if you want to leave, I'll arrange transportation to wherever you want to go." Adelaide's knees nearly buckled with relief. "You bought me, to free me," Rivers shrugged, helping her into the wagon before climbing up himself. "It was the quickest way to get you out of there." He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. "I don't hold with slavery, official or otherwise." As they left the dusty streets of Weaverville behind, Adelaide studied her rescuer's profile. Xavier Rivers was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 at most. His face was weathered from the sun, but handsome in a rugged way. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm Adelaide James." He glanced at her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Xavier Rivers. Welcome to Texas, Miss James. Sorry it wasn't under better circumstances." Adelaide looked back at the town shrinking behind them, then to the open countryside ahead. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was a start. The River X Ranch, as Xavier explained it was called, lay 15 miles outside Weaverville. As they traveled, the land transformed from scrubby brush to rolling hills dotted with stands of oak and cottonwood. A creek wound through the property, its banks lush with greenery even in the summer heat. "It's beautiful," Adelaide remarked as they crested a hill and the ranch house came into view. It was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy timber with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings were clustered nearby, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "Been in my family for 3 generations, Xavier said, a hint of pride coloring his voice. "My grandfather came out here in '32 with nothing but a horse and a dream. Built it all from scratch." As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch. She was in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a practical calico dress covered by an apron. "That's Mrs. Hernandez," Xavier explained. "She's been with us since before I was born. Runs the house with an iron fist and makes the best chili in 3 counties. The wagon pulled to a stop, and Xavier jumped down, then reached up to help Adelaide. Her legs were stiff from the journey, and she stumbled slightly as she descended, finding herself steadied by Xavier's strong hands. "You've brought company, Mr. Rivers," Mrs. Hernandez called, her accented voice carrying a note of surprise. "This is Miss Adelaide James," Xavier replied. "She'll be staying with us for a while. Miss James, this is Alina Hernandez." Mrs. Hernandez's keen eyes took in Adelaide's disheveled appearance, the marks on her wrists from the manacles, and her exhausted expression. Understanding dawned in her gaze. Another one? She asked Xavier softly. He nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Hernandez clicked her tongue. Come, child, she said to Adelaide, extending a hand. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. You look dead on your feet. Adelaide glanced at Xavier, who nodded encouragingly. Go on, you're safe here. Another one? Adelaide asked as she followed Mrs. Hernandez into the house. What did she mean by that? The housekeeper led her through a spacious, well-appointed main room toward a staircase at the back. Mr. Rivers has a habit of intervening when he sees injustice, she explained. Last month, it was a Chinese man being beaten by miners. Month before that, a family of freed slaves being harassed on their homestead. Adelaide's estimation of Xavier Rivers rose even further as she followed Mrs. Hernandez upstairs to a bedroom that seemed luxurious after weeks of hardship. A large four-poster bed dominated the space, with a washstand, wardrobe, and dressing table completing the furnishings. I'll have bathwater brought up, Mrs. Hernandez said, and find you some clean clothes. They'll be a bit large. They belong to Mr. Rivers' sister, but they'll do until we can get something better. His sister? Adelaide asked, curious about the man who had rescued her. Miss Caroline, Mrs. Hernandez said, her expression softening. She passed 2 years ago, influenza. She shook her head sadly. Mr. Rivers hasn't been the same since. They were very close. Adelaide's heart ached for the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. I'm sorry to hear that. Life goes on, Mrs. Hernandez said pragmatically. Now you rest. I'll be back with that bathwater. Left alone, Adelaide moved to the window and looked out at the ranch. From this vantage point, she could see workers moving about mending fences, tending to horses, carrying supplies between buildings. In the distance, a herd of cattle grazed peacefully. It was all so normal. So far removed from the nightmare she'd been living. True to her word, Mrs. Hernandez returned with 2 ranch hands carrying steaming buckets of water, which they poured into a copper tub that had been brought in. The housekeeper laid out soap, towels, and a clean dress, then left Adelaide to her privacy. The bath was heavenly. Adelaide scrubbed away the dirt and grime of captivity, watching it swirl away in the water. With each pass of the cloth over her skin, she felt more of herself returning the self that had been buried beneath layers of fear and despair. After dressing in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue cotton dress that hung a bit loosely on her frame and combing out her long auburn hair, Adelaide made her way downstairs. She found Xavier in what appeared to be a study, bent over a desk covered with papers. He looked up at her entrance and for a moment seemed at a loss for words. Miss James, he finally said, rising to his feet, you look refreshed. Thanks to your hospitality, she replied. Mr. Rivers, I don't know how to thank you properly for what you did today. He waved away her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't, she pointed out. You did. A flush crept up his neck. Well, hungry, Mrs. Hernandez has dinner nearly ready. Over a meal of tender beef, beans, and fresh baked bread, Adelaide told Xavier her story, how she'd been lured west with the promise of a teaching position, only to be abducted en route by men who specialized in providing companionship to lonely miners and ranchers in remote areas. They took everything, my luggage, my savings, even my father's pocket watch, she concluded. I have nothing left. Xavier's expression had darkened as she spoke. These men, would you recognize them again? Adelaide nodded. The leader was tall with a scar across his right cheek. Called himself Smith, though I doubt that's his real name. Jedediah Smith, Xavier said grimly. He's known around these parts. Sheriff's been trying to build a case against him for years, but witnesses have a habit of disappearing. What will happen to the other women? Adelaide asked, thinking of the 3 others who had been in the wagon with her, destined for other towns and other auction blocks. I'll send word to the sheriff tomorrow, Xavier promised, and to friends of mine in the neighboring counties. Smith's operation just might be coming to an end. After dinner, Xavier showed Adelaide around the main floor of the house, the parlor with its comfortable furnishings, the small library filled with books, the music room with a piano that had belonged to his mother. Do you play? Adelaide asked, noticing how his fingers lingered on the instrument's polished surface. Not well, he admitted, Caroline was the musician in the family. She tried to teach me, but I was always too busy learning the ranch. I could play something, Adelaide offered, if you'd like. His face brightened. Would you? Adelaide sat at the bench and positioned her hands over the keys. It had been months since she'd played. Her father's piano had been sold to pay his medical debts, but her fingers remembered. She began with a simple folk melody, then transitioned into a chop-in nocturne. She became so absorbed in the music that she almost forgot Xavier's presence until she finished and heard his quiet applause. Looking up, she was startled by the emotion in his eyes. That was beautiful, he said. Caroline used to play that piece. Adelaide felt a connection to this man that surprised her with its intensity. She had good taste. Later, as she lay in the comfortable bed in the guest room, Adelaide reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. From captivity to freedom in the span of a day, all because of the intervention of a man she'd never met before. Xavier Rivers was unlike anyone she'd encountered, a paradox of gentle strength, capable of threatening a man like Haggerty one moment and looking moved to tears by piano music the next. For the first time since her father's death, Adelaide fell asleep feeling safe. The next morning, Adelaide woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the distant sounds of ranch life already in progress. She dressed in another borrowed outfit, a simple skirt and blouse that Mrs. Hernandez had altered overnight to better fit her slender frame, and made her way downstairs. She found Xavier on the front porch, drinking coffee and reviewing what appeared to be a ledger. He looked up as she approached, a smile warming his features. "Morning, Miss James. Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for her from a pot on the small table. "Your home is lovely. Thank you." He closed the ledger and set it aside. "I've sent Miguel into town with a message for Sheriff Taylor about Smith and his operation. And I've been thinking about your situation." Adelaide tensed slightly. Despite his kindness so far, she was still essentially stranded, with no money and no possessions. As if sensing her unease, Xavier hurried on. "The town of Weaverville has been trying to establish a proper school for over a year now. The last teacher left after 2 months, couldn't handle frontier life. If you're interested, I could speak to the town council on your behalf." Adelaide's heart leapt. "You would do that?" He shrugged. "You said you're a teacher. We need a teacher. Seems like a simple solution." "But I have no references." "No, you have my recommendation," Xavier interrupted. "That carries weight in these parts." Adelaide was overwhelmed by his continued generosity. "Mr. Rivers, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," he replied. "In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need." Before she could respond, a ranch hand approached the porch. "Boss, we've got trouble with the north fence line. Looks like someone cut it during the night, lost about 20 head. Xavier's expression hardened. "Rustle up the boys, Thomas. I'll be right there." He turned back to Adelaide. "Duty calls. Make yourself at home. Mrs. Hernandez can show you around if you're interested." As he strode toward the stables, Adelaide was struck by the contrast between the gentle man who had played host to her and the commanding rancher now preparing to deal with cattle thieves. Xavier Rivers, it seemed, contained multitudes. Over the next few days, Adelaide fell into a rhythm at the ranch. She spent mornings helping Mrs. Hernandez with household tasks, learning about the operation of the ranch from the housekeeper's endless supply of stories and information. In the afternoons, she often read in the library or played the piano, finding comfort in these familiar activities. Xavier was frequently busy with ranch work, but made time each evening to sit with her after dinner, asking about her day and telling her stories of frontier life. She learned that he had inherited the ranch when his father died 5 years earlier, that his mother had passed when he was just 14, and that his sister Caroline had been his closest confidante until her untimely death. "She would have liked you," he told Adelaide one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in dramatic oranges and purples. "Caroline always said I needed more people in my life who could appreciate beauty. And do you?" Adelaide asked, finding herself increasingly comfortable in his presence. Xavier considered the question seriously. "I think I do," he finally said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. On the 5th day of her stay, Xavier returned from town with news. "The school board wants to meet you," he announced over lunch. "I've arranged for you to come into Weaverville tomorrow if that suits you." Adelaide's stomach fluttered with nerves and excitement. "Yes, of course, thank you. And there's more," he added. "Sheriff Taylor has apprehended Smith and 2 of his men. They were trying to set up another auction in Caldwell County. He'd like you to come in and identify them if you're willing." The thought of facing her captors again sent a chill through Adelaide, but she nodded firmly. "I'll do it." "What about the other women? 2 have been found and freed," Xavier said. "The search continues for the others." That night, Adelaide couldn't sleep. The possibility of starting a new life as a teacher in Weaverville both excited and terrified her. And beneath that, a more confusing emotion was taking root: her growing feelings for Xavier Rivers. He had been nothing but kind and respectful, never once making her feel indebted to him or expecting anything in return for his help. Yet she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his brown hair, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle strength of his hands as he worked. Such thoughts were dangerous, she reminded herself. She was in no position to entertain romantic notions about anyone, let alone the man who had rescued her. Her priority had to be establishing independence, not falling into another form of dependence, no matter how benevolent. With that resolution firmly in mind, Adelaide finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of a small schoolhouse filled with eager young minds and a certain blue-eyed rancher watching from the doorway. The next day dawned clear and bright. Mrs. Hernandez had prepared a special outfit for Adelaide, a proper visiting dress in a becoming shade of green, with a matching bonnet. "You represent the ranch now," the housekeeper said as she helped Adelaide with the final touches. "Must make a good impression." Xavier was waiting by the wagon, dressed more formally than Adelaide had yet seen him, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and string tie. He looked handsome and respectable, every inch the successful rancher. "You look lovely," he said as he helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you," Adelaide replied, hoping he would attribute her blush to the morning sun. The ride to Weaverville took just over an hour. Xavier pointed out landmarks along the way: the creek that marked the boundary of his property, the hill where his grandfather had first decided to settle, the old Comanche trail that was now used by traders moving between settlements. As they approached the town, Adelaide was struck by how much more civilized it appeared in the daylight. Weaverville proper consisted of one main street with various businesses: a general store, a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a small church, and various other establishments. Side streets branched off, lined with modest homes. "The school's at the north end of town," Xavier explained as they rode down the main street, nodding greetings to various townspeople who called out to him. "It's small, but the town council has plans to expand it as the population grows." Their first stop, however, was the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with barred windows and a sign proclaiming T. Taylor, Sheriff, hanging above the door. Sheriff Taylor was a weathered man in his 50s with an impressive mustache and keen eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He greeted Xavier warmly and Adelaide respectfully. "Miss James, I can't tell you how sorry I am for what happened to you," he said after introductions were made. "Rest assured, Smith and his men will face justice." The identification process was mercifully brief. Through a small window in the jail door, Adelaide confirmed that the 3 men in the cells were indeed her captors. Smith glared at her with such hatred that she involuntarily stepped back, colliding with Xavier, who had positioned himself protectively behind her. "They'll hang for this," Sheriff Taylor assured her. "We've got enough witnesses now, including the other women we managed to locate." "Thank you," Adelaide said, relieved that at least this chapter of her ordeal was closing. Their next stop was the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with rows of desks, a teacher's desk at the front, and a small bell tower on top. Inside, 3 men awaited them, the members of the Weaverville School Board. The interview was more challenging than the jail visit. The board members: Mr. Peterson, the banker, Mr. Whitaker, the general store owner, and Reverend Hollins from the local church questioned Adelaide thoroughly about her education, teaching experience, and philosophy. "We have 28 children enrolled currently, ages 6 to 16, Mr. Peterson explained. Can you handle such a diverse group? In Boston, I taught a class of 32 with a similar age range," Adelaide replied confidently. "I believe in tailoring instruction to meet individual needs while maintaining group cohesion." "And what subjects do you feel qualified to teach?" Reverend Hollins inquired. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, basic sciences, and music," Adelaide answered. "I also speak some French and Latin." The men exchanged impressed glances. "Miss James comes highly recommended," Xavier added. "I've had the pleasure of hearing her play piano. She's quite accomplished." After another half-hour of questions, the board asked for a few minutes to confer privately. Xavier led Adelaide outside to wait. "You were wonderful," he told her as they stood in the schoolyard. "They'd be fools not to hire you on the spot." Adelaide smiled nervously. "I hope so. I really need this position." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, disappointment perhaps. But before she could analyze it, the door opened and the board members emerged. "Miss James," Mr. Peterson said formally, "we would be honored if you would accept the position of schoolteacher for Weaverville. The term begins in 3 weeks on September 1st. The salary is $40 per month, with accommodation provided in the teacher's cottage behind the school." Adelaide's heart soared. "I accept," she said without hesitation. "Thank you for this opportunity." As they left the schoolhouse, Xavier suggested lunch at the hotel dining room to celebrate. The meal was pleasant, though Adelaide noticed Xavier seemed somewhat subdued. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked as they finished their coffee. Xavier looked up, seeming to shake himself from deep thought. "Of course, just thinking about ranch matters." But Adelaide sensed it was more than that. On the ride back to the ranch, they discussed practical arrangements. Adelaide would need clothing, basic household items, and teaching supplies before the term started. "I'm afraid I have no money to purchase these things," she admitted. "Perhaps I could arrange credit with the general store until I receive my first month's salary." "Nonsense," Xavier said. "Consider it an advance from the ranch. You can repay me when you're settled if it makes you feel better." Adelaide wanted to protest, but the truth was she had no alternatives. "Thank you," she said instead. "You've been more than generous." Xavier glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's what anyone would do." "You keep saying that," Adelaide replied, "but we both know it isn't true." When they returned to the ranch, Mrs. Hernandez was waiting with news. "A package came for you, Miss James," she said, sounding puzzled, "from the sheriff's office." The package, wrapped in brown paper and string, contained a miracle Adelaide's father's pocket watch, her mother's locket, and a small leather pouch containing $20 in gold coins. "Sheriff Taylor must have recovered these from Smith," Xavier said, watching as Adelaide clutched the precious family heirlooms. "He works quickly." "I never thought I'd see these again," Adelaide whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She fastened the locket around her neck, its familiar weight comforting against her skin. "At least now I have something of my own again." That evening after dinner, Adelaide found Xavier in the library, staring pensively at a book he didn't seem to be reading. "I wanted to thank you again," she said from the doorway, "for everything." He looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Adelaide." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I know," she replied, stepping into the room, "but I want to. You've changed my life, Xavier." His name felt right on her lips, intimate but not presumptuous. "You'll be leaving soon," he said, setting aside his book. "The teacher's cottage will be ready next week, Mrs. Hernandez tells me." Adelaide nodded. "Yes, I should be settled before the term begins." "The house will be quieter without you," Xavier said, a wistful note in his voice. "I've grown accustomed to your playing in the evenings." Adelaide's heart beat faster. "I've enjoyed my time here," she admitted, "more than I expected to." Xavier stood and moved toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Weaverville isn't far," he said. "Perhaps I could call on you sometimes. If that would be acceptable, the proper thing would be to hesitate to maintain a dignified reserve, but Adelaide was tired of propriety. Life was too short and too precious for such games. "I would like that very much," she said honestly. His smile then was like the sun breaking through clouds, transforming his entire face. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The week before Adelaide was to move to the teacher's cottage passed in a flurry of preparation. Xavier took her to town twice more, once to order necessary items from the general store, and once to meet some of the parents of her future pupils at a small gathering organized by the school board. On her last evening at the River X Ranch, Adelaide found herself reluctant to leave the porch where she and Xavier had taken to watching the sunset together. The sky was particularly spectacular that night, streaked with crimson and gold as the sun sank behind the western hills. "I'll miss this view," she said softly. "It'll still be here," Xavier replied, his voice equally quiet. "Anytime you want to see it." Adelaide turned to look at him and found him already watching her, his gaze more intense than the sunset. Xavier, whatever she had been about to say was interrupted by the arrival of a ranch hand riding hard up to the house. "Mr. Rivers, riders coming in from the north, looks like trouble." Xavier was on his feet instantly, the peaceful moment shattered. "How many?" "6, maybe 7, the hand reported. "Armed and moving fast." Xavier turned to Adelaide. "Get inside. Tell Mrs. Hernandez to lock the doors and stay away from the windows." Adelaide hesitated, reluctant to leave him. "Xavier, please, Adelaide," he said urgently. "I need to know you're safe." Something in his voice convinced her. She hurried inside to find Mrs. Hernandez, who was already moving efficiently through the house, closing shutters and locking doors. "What's happening?" Adelaide asked. "Could be anything," the housekeeper replied calmly. "Rustlers, bandits, drunken cowboys. Best to be prepared." From inside they heard shouts and the pounding of hooves as the riders approached the house. Adelaide moved toward the window, but Mrs. Hernandez pulled her back. "Mr. Rivers can handle this," she said firmly. "He's dealt with worse." Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, listening to muffled voices outside. Then came the sound Adelaide had been dreading: gunshots. 1, 2, 3 in rapid succession. Mrs. Hernandez crossed herself but remained outwardly calm. Adelaide clutched her father's watch, which she now carried in her pocket, and prayed as she hadn't since she was a child. After what seemed an eternity, they heard Xavier's voice calling from the porch. "It's safe now, Mrs. Hernandez. Adelaide." They rushed to the door. Xavier stood there, a rifle in one hand, looking grim but unharmed. Behind him, Adelaide could see his ranch hands leading away 4 men with their hands tied. "What happened?" she asked, relief making her voice shake. "Smith's associates," Xavier explained tersely. "They came looking for revenge. Apparently they blame you for identifying him." His jaw tightened. "And me for interfering with their business." Adelaide's blood ran cold. "Is anyone hurt?" "One of them took a bullet in the shoulder when he tried to draw on Thomas," Xavier said. "Otherwise, no." "We're taking them to Sheriff Taylor." He turned to Mrs. Hernandez. "I need to ride into town with the men. I'll be back late." The housekeeper nodded. "We'll be fine. I have my shotgun." Xavier looked at Adelaide, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry about this. It's not the peaceful last evening I'd hoped to give you." "It's not your fault," Adelaide assured him, though her heart was still racing from the fright. After Xavier and most of the hands had departed with their prisoners, Mrs. Hernandez insisted on serving a proper dinner despite the disruption. "Can't let trouble ruin a good meal," she declared. Later, as Adelaide prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events with a growing sense of unease. The men had come looking for her for revenge. What if they had others working with them? Would she be safe in the teacher's cottage, alone in town? But she refused to be ruled by fear again. She had survived captivity and auction. She would not let these men steal her hard-won freedom and independence. When Xavier returned well after midnight, Adelaide was still awake, sitting in the library with a book she wasn't reading. He looked exhausted but satisfied as he entered the room. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I couldn't," she admitted. "I kept thinking about what happened." Xavier sighed and sank into the chair opposite her. Sheriff Taylor is holding the men. With the charges against them, they won't see freedom for many years, if ever." He leaned forward, meeting her eyes. "You're safe, Adelaide, I promise you that." "I believe you," she said, and she did. Somehow, in the short time she'd known him, Xavier Rivers had earned her complete trust, something she'd given to very few people in her life. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment's silence. "Perhaps it would be better if you stayed here a bit longer. Just until we're certain there aren't others looking for you." The offer was tempting, more tempting than it should have been, but Adelaide knew she couldn't accept. "I appreciate your concern," she said gently, "but I can't live in fear, Xavier. I need to begin my life again, the life they tried to take from me." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "I understand, but I'll be checking on you regularly if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. Something shifted in the air between them, then a recognition, perhaps, of feelings that had been growing since that first day on the auction platform. Xavier rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hand in his. "Adelaide," he began, his voice husky. "I know we haven't known each other long," but once again they were interrupted, this time by Mrs. Hernandez clearing her throat from the doorway. "Pardon, Mr. Rivers," she said, her expression carefully neutral. "Miguel has returned from town with an urgent message from the sheriff." Xavier reluctantly released Adelaide's hand and stood. "Excuse me," he said, his eyes promising they would continue their conversation later. After he left, Mrs. Hernandez lingered, giving Adelaide a knowing look. "He cares for you very much, Miss James." "And I for him," Adelaide admitted, seeing no point in denial. "Good," the housekeeper said with a decisive nod. "He has been alone too long." The next morning, Adelaide woke early to find Xavier already gone. The urgent message had apparently required his immediate attention. Mrs. Hernandez explained that he had ridden out before dawn, but had promised to return in time to escort Adelaide to her new home in town. By mid-afternoon, however, he had not returned, and Adelaide was beginning to worry. The wagon was loaded with her few possessions, including some books and household items Xavier had insisted she take from the ranch's stores. "Perhaps we should wait another day," Mrs. Hernandez suggested, but Adelaide was determined to stick to the plan. "The school board is expecting me today. I can't disappoint them before I've even started teaching." Finally, it was decided that Thomas, the most trusted of the ranch hands, would drive Adelaide to town. They were just preparing to leave when a rider appeared on the horizon, pushing his horse to a gallop. "It's Mr. Rivers," Thomas confirmed, shading his eyes against the sun. Xavier rode directly to the wagon, dismounting in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. He looked tired but exhilarated. "Sorry I'm late," he said, breathing hard. "There was a situation with Smith." Adelaide's heart skipped. "What happened?" "He tried to escape during a prisoner transfer," Xavier explained. "Sheriff Taylor and I tracked him to the border. He won't be troubling anyone again." The grim finality in his voice told Adelaide all she needed to know. Jedediah Smith had met justice one way or another. "Let me wash up quickly," Xavier said, "and I'll take you to town myself as promised." The journey to Weaverville was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Adelaide couldn't help wondering if this marked the end of something that had barely begun, if the ease and intimacy they had shared at the ranch would fade once she was established in town. The teacher's cottage proved to be a small but pleasant structure, 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen/dining area, and a parlor and 1 bedroom upstairs, with a small bathroom off the kitchen containing a copper tub and pump. It sat behind the schoolhouse, with a neat garden plot and a few fruit trees providing privacy from the main street. Xavier carried in her trunks and boxes, placing them where Adelaide directed. When everything was unloaded, they stood awkwardly in the middle of the parlor, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Well," Xavier said finally, "you're all set." Adelaide nodded. "Thank you again for everything." "I meant what I said about checking on you," he said, his hand moving to adjust his hat, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. "And if you need anything at all." "I know where to find you," she finished for him. He took a step toward the door, then turned back suddenly. "Adelaide, what I was trying to say last night before we were interrupted," a knock at the door cut him off. Adelaide bit back a laugh of frustration. Were they destined to never finish a serious conversation? It was Reverend Hollins at the door, come to welcome her to town and invite her to Sunday services. By the time she had thanked him and he had departed, the moment with Xavier had passed. "I should let you settle in," he said, his formal tone returning. "Good evening, Miss James." "Good evening, Mr. Rivers," she replied, matching his formality though it pained her. As she watched him ride away, Adelaide felt a heaviness settle in her chest. She was free, independent, employed in her chosen profession, everything she had hoped for when she'd first decided to come west. So why did it suddenly feel like something essential was missing? The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Adelaide threw herself into readying the schoolhouse and developing lesson plans for her diverse group of students. She met many of the town's residents, finding most to be welcoming and kind. Several mothers invited her to tea, eager to make a good impression on their children's new teacher. True to his word, Xavier came to town frequently, ostensibly on ranch business, but he always found time to call on Adelaide. Their conversations remained pleasant but somewhat reserved, as if both were afraid to revisit the deeper connection they had begun to form at the ranch. On the Sunday before school was to begin, Adelaide attended services at Reverend Hollins' church. The small building was packed with most of Weaverville's residents, including, to her surprise, Xavier. He normally attended the Catholic church in the next town over with Mrs. Hernandez out of respect for the housekeeper's faith. After the service, as people mingled in the churchyard, Xavier made his way to Adelaide's side. "Good morning," he said, looking handsome in his Sunday best. "Ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "I admit to some nervousness." "You'll be wonderful," he assured her. "The children are lucky to have you." Before she could respond, they were joined by Mr. Peterson and his wife, who engaged Adelaide in conversation about the school schedule. By the time she was free again, Xavier had been pulled away by another rancher wanting to discuss cattle prices. It wasn't until everyone else had departed that Xavier approached her again, offering to walk her home. The short distance from the church to her cottage had never seemed so long and yet so brief. At her door, Xavier removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Adelaide, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart quickened. "Yes. Would you consider having dinner with me next Saturday?" At the hotel, it was such a normal, proper request, the kind a gentleman might make of a lady he was courting, that Adelaide almost laughed with relief. "I would like that very much," she said. His answering smile was worth the weeks of uncertainty. "Good, I'll call for you at 6. As he walked away, Adelaide felt lighter than she had in days. Perhaps they could find their way back to the easy connection they'd shared at the ranch after all. The first day of school was both exhausting and exhilarating. Adelaide's 28 pupils ranged from shy 6-year-old twins to a lanky 16-year-old boy who clearly would have preferred to be working rather than studying. But all were respectful, if not uniformly enthusiastic, and by day's end, Adelaide felt cautiously optimistic about the term ahead. She was just locking up the schoolhouse when she spotted a familiar figure leaning against the fence. Xavier, his hat tipped low over his eyes, watching her with a smile. "How was it?" he asked as she approached. "Challenging," she admitted, "but good. They're bright children for the most part." "I knew you'd be a natural," he said, falling into step beside her. "Mrs. Hernandez sent these." He handed her a basket covered with a cloth. "She was worried you wouldn't have time to cook after your first day." The gesture touched Adelaide deeply. "Please thank her for me." That was very thoughtful. They reached her cottage, and Adelaide hesitated before asking, "Would you like to come in? There's plenty of food." Xavier looked tempted but shook his head. "Best not," he said. Tongues would wag. He was right, of course. A single woman entertaining a man alone in her home would be the subject of gossip by morning, no matter how innocent the encounter. As the town's new teacher, Adelaide needed to be beyond reproach. "Saturday, then," she said, trying not to show her disappointment. "Saturday," he confirmed, his eyes conveying what he couldn't say aloud. The rest of the week fell into a patterned school days filled with lessons and getting to know her pupils. Evenings spent preparing for the next day and occasionally socializing with the townsfolk who had welcomed her so warmly. Xavier didn't return to town, busy with ranch matters that required his full attention. But he sent a note with a ranch hand on Thursday, confirming their dinner plans and expressing his eagerness to see her again. Adelaide read the note multiple times, tracing his bold handwriting with her fingertip. It was proper and restrained exactly what a gentleman would write to a lady he was courting, but she detected an undercurrent of something more in the carefully chosen words. By Saturday evening, Adelaide was in a state of nervous anticipation. She had splurged on a new dress with some of her recovered money, a becoming shade of blue that matched her eyes, with a modestly scooped neckline and sleeves that ended just below the elbow. Precisely at 6, there was a knock at her door. Xavier stood on her porch, freshly shaven and dressed in what she assumed were his finest clothes, a black suit with a white shirt and string tie. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the flowers. "You're quite handsome yourself." The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Weaverville, with white tablecloths, proper silverware, and a menu that aspired to Eastern sophistication. They were seated at a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners but still very much in public view. Conversation flowed easily between them, as it had in the early days at the ranch. Xavier told her about his latest project's improvements to the cattle pens, a new breeding program he was implementing, while Adelaide shared stories about her first week of teaching. "The Donovan boy Michael reminds me of myself at that age," Xavier admitted. "More interested in the outdoors than books. He's actually quite bright," Adelaide said. "He solved a mathematics problem yesterday that stumped some of the older children. He just needs to find his motivation." Xavier smiled warmly at her. "You see the best in everyone, don't you?" "Not everyone," she replied, thinking of Smith and his associates, "but I try to look beyond the surface." "Is that what you did with me?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. "Looked beyond the surface." Adelaide met his gaze steadily. "I saw a man who risked himself to help a stranger, who offered kindness with no expectation of return, who respects women and treats his workers fairly." She paused. "Yes, I looked beyond the surface, Xavier, and I liked what I found there." His hand moved across the table to cover hers briefly, a bold gesture in such a public setting, but one that sent warmth coursing through her. "I've been trying to find the right words," he said quietly, "to tell you how I feel, but I'm not a man of fancy speech." "Then speak plainly," she encouraged him. "I prefer honesty to eloquence." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Adelaide, more than I thought possible after knowing someone for such a short time. When you're not around, I find myself thinking about when I'll see you next. When you are around, I can't seem to take my eyes off you," he smiled self-consciously. "Is that plain enough?" "Perfectly plain," she replied, her heart racing, "and perfectly mutual." The look that passed between them then needed no words at all. After dinner, Xavier walked Adelaide home through the quiet streets of Weaverville. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. They walked close together, not quite touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. At her door, Xavier took both her hands in his. "May I call on you properly?" With the intention of courtship, Adelaide smiled at the formality. "Yes, Xavier, I would like that very much." He hesitated, clearly debating with himself, then slowly leaned forward. Adelaide closed her eyes as his lips met hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that asked rather than demanded. She responded in kind, her hands moving to rest lightly on his shoulders. When they parted, Xavier looked slightly dazed. "I've been wanting to do that since the day we met," he admitted. "Even when I was covered in dust and wearing chains," she teased gently. "Even then," he confirmed, completely serious. "You were the bravest person I'd ever seen." Adelaide blushed at the compliment. "Good night, Xavier." "Good night, Adelaide." He waited until she was safely inside before departing. Adelaide leaned against the closed door, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Adelaide's life. She threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm, winning over even her most reluctant students with her genuine interest in their progress. The town embraced her as one of their own, inviting her to social gatherings and community events. And then there was Xavier. True to his word, he courted her, properly calling on her regularly, taking her to church socials and town dances, bringing small, thoughtful gifts that showed how well he was coming to know her. They were discreet, mindful of Adelaide's position as the town's teacher, but it soon became common knowledge in Weaverville that Xavier Rivers had serious intentions toward Miss James. Far from disapproving, most of the townsfolk seemed delighted by the match. "It's about time that boy settled down," Mrs. Peterson told Adelaide after church one Sunday. "That ranch needs a woman's touch again." As autumn painted the Texas countryside in rich golds and reds, Adelaide found herself falling deeply in love with both the land and the man. Xavier took her riding on his property, showing her hidden spots of beauty that few ever saw: a secluded pond surrounded by cottonwoods, a hilltop with views that stretched for miles, a small canyon where wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing season. It was in this canyon, on a crisp October afternoon, that Xavier finally spoke the words that had been growing between them. "I love you, Adelaide," he said simply, helping her down from her horse. "I think I've loved you since that first day when you stood on that auction platform with your chin up, refusing to be broken." Adelaide's heart swelled with emotion. "And I love you, Xavier. You saved more than my freedom that day. You saved my hope." He took her in his arms then, kissing her with a passion that had been building for months. Adelaide responded in kind, her reserve finally melting away in the warmth of their shared feelings. When they finally separated, Xavier kept his arms around her, as if afraid she might disappear. "Marry me," he said, his blue eyes intense with emotion. "Be my wife, my partner in everything. Help me make the River X Ranch a true home again." Adelaide didn't hesitate. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that lit his face was like sunshine after storm. From his pocket, he produced a small box containing a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to her when they decided to make their life here. I've been carrying it since our first dinner in town." Adelaide admired the ring, then looked up at Xavier with tears of joy in her eyes. "It's perfect, but what about the school? I've made a commitment." "The term ends at Christmas," Xavier pointed out. "We could marry then if you wish. Or wait until spring if you prefer. I don't care when, Adelaide, as long as you become my wife." "Christmas," she decided. "I don't want to wait longer than necessary." He kissed her again, sealing their agreement in the most pleasant possible way. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Weaverville and the surrounding area. Congratulations poured in from townsfolk and neighboring ranchers alike. Even Mr. Whitaker, who had initially been the most skeptical member of the school board, offered his good wishes. "I suppose we'll need to find a new teacher for the spring term," he said with a sigh. "Though none will measure up to you, Miss James." "Actually," Adelaide replied, "I was hoping we might discuss an alternative arrangement." The arrangement she proposed was unconventional but practical. She would continue teaching 3 days a week, with an assistant handling the other 2 days. This would allow her to fulfill both her responsibilities as Mrs. Rivers and her commitment to the children of Weaverville. After some debate, the school board agreed to her proposal on a trial basis. Xavier supported her completely, proud of her dedication and unwilling to ask her to give up something that brought her such satisfaction. "You'll be the first rancher's wife who's also a school teacher," he told her with a grin. "Just another way you're exceptional." As Christmas approached, wedding preparations consumed much of Adelaide's free time. Mrs. Hernandez took charge of the household arrangements, while the women of Weaverville organized a quilting bee to create a wedding present for the couple. The ceremony was set for December 23rd, allowing for a brief honeymoon before the start of the new year. Adelaide wrote to her few remaining friends in Boston, inviting them to attend if possible, though she knew the distance and winter weather made it unlikely. To her surprise and delight, she received a response from her father's former colleague, Dr. William Harrison, informing her that he and his wife would make the journey. "Your father would be so proud of the life you've built," he wrote. "We wouldn't miss this day for the world." The week before the wedding, a heavy snowfall blanketed Weaverville and the surrounding countryside. Xavier worried that it might force a postponement, but Adelaide was undeterred. "A little snow won't stop us," she declared. "I've waited my whole life to find you, Xavier Rivers. I won't wait a day longer than necessary to become your wife." On the morning of December 23rd, Adelaide stood in her cottage, surrounded by Mrs. Hernandez and several women from town who had come to help her prepare. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant ivory satin with lace trim, ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Harrison told her as she arranged Adelaide's hair. The doctor and his wife had arrived 2 days earlier, braving the snow-covered roads to keep their promise. "I feel beautiful," Adelaide replied honestly, "and happy, so very happy." The ceremony was held in the town church, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the season. Every seat was filled townsfolk, ranch hands, neighboring ranchers, and even Sheriff Taylor had come to witness the union. Xavier waited at the altar, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his new suit. When the doors opened and Adelaide appeared on Dr. Harrison's arm, his expression transformed to one of pure joy. The ceremony itself was traditional and brief. They exchanged vows written by Reverend Hollins, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. When Xavier slipped the gold band onto Adelaide's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady but his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hollins declared. "Mr. Rivers, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was both tender and promising, greeted by enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward was held at the River X Ranch, the main house transformed by Mrs. Hernandez's efforts into a festive wonderland. Food and drink flowed freely, music played, and dancing continued well into the night. As evening deepened, Xavier led Adelaide away from the revelry to a quiet corner of the porch where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset together. "Happy, Mrs. Rivers?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully, leaning back against his chest. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would find love in a Texas border town, I would have thought them mad. 6 months ago, I was a lonely rancher with little to look forward to beyond work and duty," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now I have a brilliant, beautiful wife and a future full of promise." Adelaide turned in his arms to face him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day when Haggerty tried to buy me?" Xavier frowned slightly. "I said many things. You said these hands break steel for souls like yours," Adelaide reminded him, taking his hands in hers. "I didn't understand then what you meant." "I'm not sure I did either," he admitted. "It just came out." "I think I understand now," she said softly. "You weren't talking about physical strength. You were talking about determination, about breaking the chains that bind people whether they're made of steel or fear or prejudice." Xavier considered this, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps all I knew in that moment was that I couldn't let him take you, and I'm eternally grateful," Adelaide said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "for my freedom and for the love we've found." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the household had quieted, Xavier carried Adelaide across the threshold of the master bedroom, now their bedroom. They had agreed to spend their wedding night at the ranch, before departing for San Antonio the following day for a brief honeymoon. Their coming together as husband and wife was everything Adelaide had hoped for: tender, passionate, and deeply loving. In Xavier's arms, she found a completion she hadn't known she was seeking, a sense of rightness that transcended physical pleasure. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the bedsheets, Xavier traced gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he confessed. "After Caroline died, I thought I was destined to be alone. The ranch became my whole world. And now—" Adelaide prompted, propping herself up to look into his eyes. "Now my world is you," he said simply. "Everything else, the ranch, the cattle, even this land I love so much, it's all just the setting for our life together." Adelaide kissed him, overwhelmed by the depth of her feelings. "I love you, Xavier Rivers." "And I love you, Adelaide Rivers," he replied, the new name sending a thrill through her, "forever and always." Spring came early to Texas in 1877, bringing with it new beginnings for the River X Ranch. Adelaide had settled into her dual roles as rancher's wife and part-time schoolteacher with remarkable ease. 3 days a week, she taught the children of Weaverville, while the remaining days were devoted to ranch matters and creating a true home with Xavier. The teacher's cottage in town had been converted into a small schoolhouse annex, where Adelaide's assistant, Miss Clark, lived and taught on the days Adelaide was at the ranch. The arrangement worked better than anyone had expected, with both women bringing different strengths to their shared position. At the ranch, Adelaide had thrown herself into learning everything she could about cattle raising, horse breeding, and the myriad other activities that made up ranch life. Xavier was an enthusiastic teacher, proud of his wife's quick mind and genuine interest in his world. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon as they rode back from checking a pregnant mare. "Most city women would run screaming from half the things you've taken in stride." Adelaide laughed. "I'm not most women." "Thank God for that," Xavier replied fervently. Their happiness was complete when, in late April, Adelaide confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting their first child. Xavier's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, lifted her carefully off her feet, and spun her around before setting her down with exaggerated gentleness. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Due around Christmas," Adelaide told him. "A perfect gift, don't you think?" The news spread quickly through ranch and town alike. Mrs. Hernandez immediately began knitting tiny garments, while the women of Weaverville organized yet another quilting bee to create a baby blanket. Adelaide continued teaching through the spring term, but decided, with Xavier's full support, to take a sabbatical for the fall. "The children will still get a proper education," she assured the school board. "Miss Clark has proven more than capable, and I'll return after the baby is old enough." Summer brought intense heat and the busiest season on the ranch. Despite her condition, Adelaide insisted on maintaining her normal activities, though she conceded to Xavier's anxious hovering by resting during the hottest part of the day. "The women in my family have always had easy pregnancies," she assured him. "My mother used to say the James women were built for childbearing." Nevertheless, Xavier insisted on hiring additional help for the household, bringing in a young widow from town to assist Mrs. Hernandez with the heavier work. As Adelaide's body changed with the growing life inside her, their love deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Xavier was endlessly fascinated by her rounded belly, spending evenings with his head in her lap, talking to their unborn child about ranch life and the adventures they would have together. "What if it's a girl?" Adelaide asked one night, running her fingers through his hair. "Then she'll be as beautiful and brilliant as her mother," Xavier replied without hesitation. "And I'll teach her to ride and rope alongside any boy." Adelaide's heart swelled with love for this man, who continued to surprise her with his open-mindedness and gentle strength. In October, with Adelaide in her 7th month, they received unexpected visitors, Dr. and Mrs. Harrison from Boston, making good on their promise to return for the birth. "We couldn't miss such an important event," Dr. Harrison explained as they settled into the guest room. "Besides, I thought you might appreciate having a familiar physician attend you." Adelaide was touched by their thoughtfulness. Xavier, though initially wary of the Eastern doctor, quickly warmed to him when he realized the man's genuine concern for Adelaide's welfare. "Your wife has created quite a life for herself here," Dr. Harrison remarked to Xavier one evening as they shared cigars on the porch. "James would be amazed and proud." "She's remarkable," Xavier agreed. "I thank God every day that I was in Weaverville that afternoon." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. Providence works in mysterious ways. Who would have thought that an act of such evil, her kidnapping, would lead to such happiness? As her time grew near, Adelaide found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this place and this life. The fear and degradation of her captivity seemed like a distant nightmare now, overshadowed by the joy she had found with Xavier and the community that had embraced her. December brought cool weather and increasing anticipation. The nursery, once Caroline's bedroom, had been transformed with a handcrafted crib made by Xavier himself. A rocking chair moved from the parlor, and the colorful quilt created by the women of Weaverville. Adelaide's labor began in the early hours of December 15th, almost exactly a year after she and Xavier had exchanged their wedding vows. Mrs. Harrison and Mrs. Hernandez attended her, with Dr. Harrison overseeing the proceedings with calm professionalism. Xavier, banished to the parlor after being deemed too anxious to be helpful, wore a path in the carpet with his pacing. Every cry from upstairs sent him to the bottom of the staircase, only to be shooed back by whoever came down for supplies. After 6 hours of labor, remarkably quick for a first child, according to Dr. Harrison, Adelaide delivered a healthy son with a lusty cry and a full head of dark hair. "He has your eyes," she told Xavier when he was finally allowed to enter the bedroom, "and your chin." Xavier cradled his son with awe, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William James Rivers William for doctor. Harrison, who had delivered him safely, James for Adelaide's father, who would never know his grandson, and Rivers, the name that had come to mean home and love to Adelaide. As Christmas approached, the ranch filled with visitors coming to meet the newest Rivers and celebrate the holiday. Sheriff Taylor brought a hand-carved wooden horse. Mr. Peterson and his wife arrived with a silver cup engraved with the baby's initials. Even gruff old Mr. Whittaker made the journey from town, bearing a children's Bible for when he's old enough. On Christmas Eve, with young William sleeping peacefully in his cradle and their guests retired for the night, Adelaide and Xavier sat before the fire in the parlor, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "Happy?" Xavier asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Completely," she replied, nestling against him. "I have everything I could ever want: a husband I adore, a beautiful son, work that fulfills me, a community that has become family." Xavier kissed her temple. "Do you ever think about how it all began, that day in Weaverville?" Adelaide nodded. "Often, how close I came to a very different fate," she shuddered slightly, "if you hadn't been there." "But I was," he said firmly, "and I always will be, Adelaide, for you and for our son and for any other children we might be blessed with." "I'd like that," she said softly. "A house full of children, a legacy for the River X Ranch." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fires glow, Adelaide reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the terrified woman in chains on an auction block to beloved wife, mother, and teacher, it was a transformation she could never have imagined. Xavier had indeed broken steel for her soul that day, the literal chains of her captivity, yes, but also the invisible bonds of fear and hopelessness that had threatened to crush her spirit. In their place, he had offered freedom, respect, and a love that continued to deepen with each passing day. Outside, a light snow began to fall, unusual for Texas, but perfect for Christmas Eve. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of their home and their love, Adelaide and Xavier Rivers watched the future unfold, one precious moment at a time. 10 years later, on a bright spring morning in 1887, Adelaide stood on the porch of the River X Ranch, watching her husband and children in the corral below. Xavier was teaching 9-year-old William and 7-year-old Caroline how to gentle a young colt, while 5-year-old Thomas sat on the fence, eyes wide with admiration for his older siblings. In her arms, baby Elizabeth, just 6 months old, gurgled happily, reaching for the pendant. Adelaide always wore her mother's locket, now containing miniature portraits of Xavier and their first child. The ranch had prospered over the decade, expanding its boundaries and its operations. Xavier had introduced new breeding stock that produced hardier, more valuable cattle, while Adelaide had established a small but thriving horse breeding program focusing on the Spanish bloodlines she'd come to admire. Weaverville had grown as well, now boasting a proper school building with 3 classrooms and as many teachers. Adelaide still taught occasionally, filling in when needed and serving on the school board that she had once interviewed before. Their life together had not been without challenges. There had been droughts that threatened the herds, a fire that destroyed one of the barns, and a particularly harsh winter that claimed several valuable animals. 2 years earlier, Mrs. Hernandez had passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving a void in the household that could never truly be filled. But through it all, their partnership had remained unshakable, a true union of equals who respected each other's strengths and supported each other through weaknesses. "Mama, look." William called, drawing her attention back to the present. He was leading the young colt in a circle, the animal following with surprising docility. "Well done," she called back, smiling at her firstborn's proud expression. Xavier caught her eye from the corral and winked, still able to send her heart racing with a single look even after a decade of marriage. He said something to the children, then made his way toward the house, climbing the porch steps with the same easy grace she'd admired from the first. "Mrs. Rivers," he greeted her formally, eyes twinkling as he leaned in to kiss her. "Mr. Rivers," she returned, shifting Elizabeth to one arm so she could smooth Xavier's graying hair back from his forehead. At 41, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, the lines at the corners of his eyes only adding character to his face. "The children are natural horsemen," he said, taking Elizabeth and bouncing her gently. "Even Thomas is showing promise, though he's still a bit small for serious riding." "They come by it honestly," Adelaide replied. "Their father is the finest horseman in the county, after all," Xavier laughed. "Their mother isn't far behind." "I still maintain you're the only woman I know who can ride astride in a split skirt and somehow look completely ladylike doing it." Adelaide smiled at the compliment, though such attire no longer raised eyebrows as it once had. The frontier was changing, becoming more settled, more civilized. Sometimes she missed the wildness of those early days, though she appreciated the conveniences that progress had brought. "Sheriff Taylor rode by earlier," she told Xavier. "He said to tell you he'll be at the Cattlemen's Association meeting tomorrow." Xavier nodded. "Good. We need to discuss the new railroad spur. It could change everything for ranchers in this region." The potential railroad expansion had been the primary topic of conversation among landowners for months. The ability to transport cattle directly from Weaverville to eastern markets would significantly increase profits and reduce the need for long, dangerous cattle drives. "Do you think they'll approve it?" Adelaide asked, taking Elizabeth back as the baby began to fuss. "I hope so," Xavier replied. "For the children's sake, if nothing else. The world is changing, Adelaide. I want them to be part of that change, not left behind by it." As if on cue, William let out a whoop of triumph as the colt nuzzled his palm, accepting the boy completely. Caroline clapped her hands in delight while Thomas bounced excitedly on the fence. "They won't be left behind," Adelaide assured him, "not with us to guide them." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Adelaide sat on the porch as they had done countless times before, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked suddenly. "Coming west, all you went through?" Adelaide considered the question seriously. "How could I regret anything that led me to you, to our children, to this life we've built together? But if you could have done it differently, come west safely, as a proper teacher with letters of introduction and a secure position." "Then we might never have met," she pointed out. "Or if we had, it would have been as the school teacher and the rancher, a passing acquaintance, nothing more." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'd like to think we would have found each other anyway." "That some things are simply meant to be." Adelaide smiled at his uncharacteristic romanticism. "Perhaps you're right, but I wouldn't change our story, Xavier, not one word of it. Not even the chains," he asked quietly. "Not even those," she confirmed. "Because they led to the moment when you said these hands break steel for souls like yours. And in that moment, even though I didn't realize it then, our journey together began." Xavier brought her hand to his lips, kissing it tenderly. "I love you, Adelaide Rivers. More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, leaning against his shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled Texas sky. yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the land that had become their legacy. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved beyond measure. And on the porch, Adelaide and Xavier Rivers sat side by side, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one free souls bound together not by chains of steel, but by the enduring power of love.